We're EarthForce. We are a national nonprofit and the home of environmental action civics. In Field Chats, you'll hear research-based, actionable tips and inspiring stories of youth-adult partnerships that empower young people to become environmental decision makers. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Field Chats, Environmental Action Civics Essentials brought to you by EarthForce. In this episode, we're sharing a Civic Research Cafe conversation with Dr. Jennifer Earl from the University of Delaware. Dr. Earl brings research that pushes back on the idea that young people aren't engaged, and instead asks us to look more closely at how adult systems support or limit youth civic action. It's a thoughtful conversation about agency, partnership, and how we think about young people's roles in change. Enjoy.
So while many people hand-wring about the levels of engagement by young people, my research and research by others finds clear evidence of pretty substantial and meaningful engagement by young people. For instance, if you consider campaigns and elections, volunteering, activism, and other forms of participatory politics all together, and you add them up, in a very high-quality national survey, only about a quarter of youth hadn't participated in any of these activities over the polling period. So if you really think about all the different ways that young people can be involved, young people are killing it. And I think that it's really important that we start from that empirical basis because a lot of times our conversations don't. In fact, my big message for today is that if you want to support young people's engagement, we need to be communicating to young people that we are their allies. We want them to be difference makers, and they can do it on their terms because their voices are important. Unfortunately, a much less productive alternative narrative confronts young people every day. That narrative criticizes young people for their tactics and decisions. So this is an article about somebody who was a civil rights activist and when they were young and got criticized for that activism, but now was struggling with some activism with Black Lives Matter. It's also a narrative that treats young people as incapable or as easy marks. Now, while these are two popular press pieces, this isn't just the media that's doing this either. There are researchers who are also involved in this conversation. So, for instance, some psychologists worry about the brain development, the psychological capacity of young people to be involved in ways that are, to me, pretty troubling. Academics, particularly people who study youth engagement, have a label for this. We call it the youth deficit model. And that youth deficit model essentially tells young people that they're not doing it right and that the only way to do it right is through adult leadership of them. So adults have to tell them how to become politically proper and then have to, sort of provide mentoring or tutelage across that engagement. While it may seem like that's something that happens outside of movements and activism, it's also something that people from my research and the research of my teammates shows that young people are experiencing even inside movements and inside movement organizations. That is, just because you're a grassroots organization doesn't mean that because you're grassroots that you're necessarily connecting with young people in productive ways. For instance, organizations may be grassroots, but still be dismissive of young people's concerns and interests. Those organizations may see themselves as existing to speak on behalf of young people. This is actually where PTAs came from, was the belief that somebody needed to speak for young people instead of young people speaking for themselves. Carrying in other kinds of adultist assumptions within organizations, like that older people know how to do things better and don't face exactly the same kinds of issues and activism that younger people face. One that you see a lot is asking for young people's labor, but not asking for their ideas, their agency, their creativity. And it's important to recognize that how this happens both outside of movements and inside of movements is a process that involves intersectional disadvantage. So if one understands young people and youth actually to be an axis of inequality, there are other parts of an intersectional identity that are amplifying these deficit processes for specific groups of young people. I think as a way to think about this, a good amount of qualitative research, like people like Gordon and Taff, who have been in young people's organizations, seeing how those organizations work, they really find that a lot of people do what the Sunrise Movement did. They say, see, we don't see ourselves, we don't feel valued, and so we actually have to step out. And so if you have an organization that has young people in it, I think a good check-in in my book is this. If you would not say the same sentence about another marginalized community, you probably shouldn't say it about young people. And if you would not design a program for another marginalized community in a specific way, you should probably not design it that way for young people either. But that's a sort of what you shouldn't do piece of advice, which isn't super inspiring. And so let's talk about what you should do. There is an alternative. And that alternative involves centering youth agency and really focusing on how elders can be allies as opposed to people who are leading the show. For instance, as researchers, we could conduct research that helps to center young people and their agency by raising both public and academic awareness of the really foundational role that young people have played in movements. This involves things like knowing what young people care about and what they want to do and their ideas on things in a way that we don't even often have data on. I do want to switch to what can organizations do? How could we use research to support young organizers as change makers directly? I think one of the first things we can do is to really move from a place of here's what you should do to a place of here are the things you may want to consider. And then part of being an activist at any age is weighing out those considerations for your own particular struggle or movement. So I was involved in a MacArthur-funded effort that produced some questions that young activists could ask themselves that was research informed. So people could ask themselves and other activists, how do I improve my messaging by figuring out why does this matter to me? That's actually something that every activist needs to figure out how to do. And young activists, like all activists, need to figure out how to do that through their lived experience in their lives. Young activists, like all activists, need to think about how much should I share? What are the boundaries between my private life, security concerns I might have, but also the authentic connection I might create with people by sharing. So in this research project, what we did was essentially try to take all of the findings that were coming out of this, and instead of saying, so you should do this, we said, here are 10 questions that we think you may want to ask yourself, that through answering them, we think you'll get to a more effective movement. But we're not going to prejudge where that answer would fall. Another example of doing this is sharing our research results in ways that are more accessible than in our research papers. So some teammates, Thomas Mayer and Thomas Elliott, and I created this Informing Activists series, which is a set of online videos hosted by a very popular social movement blog, Mobilizing Ideas. And those videos cover a range of different topics with about 3 to 5 minute videos from world-leading researchers on each of those topics. So these are some of the kinds of things that get addressed in those videos. What does research say about how movements make a difference? How and when do social movements make a political difference? There's stuff in there about tactics. There's stuff in there about leadership. And what we've done in each case is gotten a 3 to 5 minute, occasionally it's a little longer, but we try to get 3 to 5 minute videos from leading researchers to basically summarize what's the state of knowledge, so that you can get that in some digestible format and try to think through how that matters. The final set of things that you can do, I think, are try to bring research into policy and into civic education in a way that is really centered around supporting young people's engagement by reducing the roadblocks that honestly we're creating for them. We spend a lot of time creating roadblocks for young people's engagement and then blaming them, scolding them. Why didn't you get involved despite this huge set of roadblocks we placed in your way? And it turns out young people are still hurdling over those roadblocks. They're still getting involved. But we need government and schools to think about how they can actively think about their job as removing those roadblocks, and that the problem may be not with kids, but the problem may be how we're treating kids.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. We hope this conversation with Dr. Earl gives you space to reflect on how young people are engaging in your community and how adults can act more as allies. We'll see you next time.